Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going down the rabbit hole of how Coca-Cola has interacted with researchers and those public health institutions. Like the ones that are supposed to be looking out for us.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating area of study. And just to be clear, we're not here to put Coca-Cola or any company for that matter on trial.
Right.
The point is to kind of understand the subtle ways that industries can, influence research and even shape public opinion.
Okay, so think of this deep dive as our little detective mission, right? And the magnifying glass we're using. A 2020 research paper from Public Health Nutrition.
Oh, I've heard of this one.
Get this, they actually got their hands on thousands of pages, thousands of internal Coca-Cola emails.
No way. How'd they swing that?
Freedom of Information Act requests.
Oh, that's gold.
Right. Talk about a treasure trove.
Years. It's like a crash course in how these corporations, especially when it comes to health, think about their image, how they want the public to see them.
It's all about perception, right? Okay, so this study, it dug up two main strategies that Coca-Cola is using. The first one revolves around funding, but it's more nuanced than just, hey, we're giving money to research. This is about control, right?
Oh, absolutely. They knew, the public perception, the optics of being seen as this big corporate puppeteer, it wouldn't go over well.
Right.
So they took steps to kind of downplay their role as this major funder of, all this research on diet and health.
Interesting. So how did they do that? I mean, the money's got to come from somewhere, right?
So one tactic was actually bringing in additional funders.
Oh, I see.
To try and create this illusion of, diversified support, it's a whole bunch of people all agreeing.
So it's like they wanted to seem like just one voice, in this big chorus of voices, even though they were the ones, like you said, writing the biggest checks.
Exactly. And it gets even wilder. They even debated, what words to use. They talked about using specific language, very calculated, like gift or unrestricted grant.
Oh, instead of just calling it funding.
Yeah, to describe their funding. And they're doing this to minimize any perception that they're, trying to control the research.
It just shows how much thought goes into every single word, right?
Yeah.
It wasn't just about the money. It was about how that money would be perceived. Clearly, they were aware of how the public might interpret their involvement.
For sure.
Okay, so that's strategy number one, control the funding, control the message. What about the second strategy?
All right, so the second one is all about relationships. They really focused on building up this network of researchers, people they had these close ties with.
Oh, so it wasn't just about the money. It was about building these connections, cultivating influence over time.
You got it. And get this, they called this group of academics their, email family. That's what they called them.
Email family, wow.
Yeah, and they didn't stop there. They also tried to connect these researchers with, people making policy decisions.
Policymakers.
Yeah, policymakers, exactly. And they even talked about how to, help advance these researchers' careers, provide support for their institutions.
They were really in it for the long haul, weren't they? It wasn't just about funding one study and hoping for the best. It was about cultivating this whole network that could potentially promote a certain viewpoint over time.
That's exactly it. They were playing the long game here. And it's a great example of how, corporate influence can operate on all these different levels. It's not just about the funding decisions. It's also about shaping what research gets done, what questions get asked.
Right.
And it's about building those relationships with, the key opinion leaders in a field.
The people that everyone else listens to.
Yeah, and all of this is happening behind the scenes, which makes it so much harder to spot from the outside.
It's subtle, but it can be very, very effective.
Yeah.
But they didn't stop there, did they? I mean, they took this a step further by actually trying to emphasize certain types of research over others.
Right. That's right. For example, the emails show how interested Coca-Cola was in research that highlighted the importance of, energy balance.
Oh, yeah.
Calories in, calories out.
Right. The idea that if you eat more calories than you burn, well, guess what? You're going to gain weight.
Right.
Okay, so that makes sense on the surface. But what's the advantage for Coca-Cola in emphasizing this energy balance concept?
Well, think about it. If they shift the focus to energy balance, then they can kind of sidestep the issue of sugar drinks themselves. Suddenly it's not about the soda, it's about you not exercising enough or making other lifestyle choices.
So it's a way of deflecting attention away from the potential negative impacts of their products.
Clever.
Right.
Very clever.
Exactly. It's all about framing the issue in a way that benefits them, right?
Right.
And, speaking of framing, this energy balance thing, it wasn't just like a general philosophy for them. They actually put it into practice.
Oh, really? How so?
Okay, so remember that whole global energy balance network thing? Yeah, I think I've heard of that, GEBN, right?
Yeah, GEBN. So they presented this group, to the public as like this independent, scientific organization.
Right, right.
But those emails, they tell a very, very different story.
Oh, really?
Turns out Coca-Cola, they were like super involved in creating GEBN, funding it, the whole 9 yards. They saw this as their chance to like really push that energy balance message,
Yeah.
to counter what they called like biased information about sugary drinks.
Oh, so they were trying to shape the narrative like we were talking about before. It's like setting up your own think tank, to promote a certain point of view. But did it work? I mean, did people buy it?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's where things get even juicier, actually. So people started asking questions, right? Like, who's funding GBN? Well, where's all this money coming from? And you know what? Coca-Cola, they got, like, really hesitant about, coming clean about their, like, massive financial support.
Well, yeah. I mean, wouldn't you? If you're trying to create this image of independence.
Yes. The last thing you want is for people to find out that you're the puppet master behind the scenes.
Exactly. It's all about controlling the message, right? Maintaining that, facade of, oh, this is totally independent, objective science.
So what happened? Did they actually manage to exert any real influence through this network, or did it all just kind of blow up in their faces?
They tried. They really did. And there's some, evidence that suggests they wanted to use GEBN to connect with, policymakers and other bigwigs in the health world, like we were talking about before, to really try and sway those opinions.
Get their message out there.
Exactly. But ultimately, GBN, they faced a ton of scrutiny, especially, when those emails came out. And in the end, they had to disband, shut it down completely.
Wow, talk about backfiring. It seems like their attempt to, control the narrative actually had the opposite effect. But I can't imagine this was an isolated incident, right? I mean, we're talking about Coca-Cola here. Oh, you are absolutely right. This was not a one-time thing. The emails, they also show how they interacted with, individual researchers. And it went way beyond just, handing them a check and saying, do some research for us.
Oh, what kind of stuff are we talking about here?
So there's documentation of them, offering to connect these academics with, policymakers, for example.
Oh, interesting.
They even suggested research topics.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Ones that just happen to, align very nicely with Coca-Cola's interests.
Of course. What a coincidence, right?
Yeah.
So it wasn't enough to just fund research. They wanted to be involved, to shape the questions that were being asked, the connections that were being made. Did they offer anything else to these researchers? What's in it for the researchers besides maybe getting their research funded?
Well, there were these discussions about potentially funding entire academic institutions.
Wow, really?
Yeah. Which, I mean, let's be real, that creates a huge sense of obligation, right?
Yeah, for sure. It's hard to say no to someone who's paying your bills, even if it's indirectly. It's amazing what you can find out from these internal emails, right? It's we're getting this behind the scenes look at how the sausage gets made.
Yeah.
But what stands out to you is the most revealing thing in all of this?
For me, it's the lengths to which they went to, really, really manage the message,
Yeah.
remember that email chain where they were discussing how to respond if someone asked about GBN's funding?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, talk about a masterclass in PR.
They were ready, weren't they?
Oh, yeah. They wanted to have all these other funders lined up, to trot out before they even breathed a word about Coca-Cola's involvement. It just shows how aware they were of how that would look.
Yeah, it makes you wonder what they were so afraid of.
Right. And don't even get me started on that whole debate over whether to use the word gift or grant for their contributions.
Oh, yeah. That was the whole thing, wasn't it?
They actually thought that gift sounded less agenda-driven. It just goes to show how much they understood the power of language.
Yeah. It's incredible how much those little choices in wording can really shape how we perceive something. And wasn't there also that whole thing about the spokesperson Q&A?
Oh, yes, the document. Right, they literally had pre-written responses to questions that they thought people might ask about JABN.
Oh, so they were ready for anything.
Oh, yeah, prepared for every possible scenario.
Smart.
Yeah.
What were some of the pre-written answers?
So, for example, one of them said that, like, for legal reasons, they couldn't actually reveal, who was funding them without getting permission, like, from the donors.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, they even cited, like, Colorado state law.
But didn't the paper, like, call them out on that?
Oh, yeah. They did their homework. Turns out the researchers couldn't find any law in Colorado that would have actually prevented them from disclosing that Coca-Cola was a funder.
So they were using the law, or at least the appearance of it, as a shield to avoid being transparent.
It definitely makes you wonder. And it's a good reminder that, like, we're not talking about a couple people sending emails here. We're
Yeah.
talking about a whole operation, right? Like, corporations, they have entire teams of lawyers and PR people whose entire job it is to protect the company's image.
Right, right. It's their job to make sure that the company looks good no matter what.
Yeah,
And they're good at their jobs. I mean, you got to give them that. Were there any other instances where, like, they were trying to control the narrative?
Oh, yeah, tons. Like, there's this one exchange that's really telling. Rona Applebaum, she was a big deal at Coke at the time. She freaked out about a study that challenged that whole energy balance idea.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. She was
Yeah.
like, we need to get ahead of this, like full on damage control mode.
Wow. It sounds like they were terrified of anything that might contradict the message they were trying to promote. But, I mean, isn't the science, on sugary drinks kind of clear at this point?
Oh, yeah. Like, there's a very strong scientific consensus that sugary drinks contribute to a whole slew of health problems. But this shows that they were still very much aware of research that could, potentially threaten their bottom line.
Right, right.
And it's interesting, they even used the phrase some intentionally when they talked about those who question the idea of energy balance.
Some intentionally.
Yeah, almost like they thought there was this, like, deliberate campaign to undermine them.
It's like they were trying to paint themselves as the victim here,
Mhm.
even though, I mean, come on, they're Coca-Cola.
Exactly. But that's how it works, though, right? Like, if you can create doubt, if you can muddy the waters enough, it's harder for people to, like, see clearly, to figure out what's true and what's, spin.
Absolutely. It's classic misdirection. But, I want to circle back to those relationships that Coke was building with researchers, because I think that's such a crucial piece of this puzzle, and we only really scratched the surface.
Totally agree. It's something that often gets overlooked. People focus on the funding, which is important, don't get me wrong. But these relationships, these are the invisible threads that really tie everything together.
It all comes back to that phrase, that email family. It just sounds so, I don't know, so innocent.
Right, like a Hallmark movie or something?
Yeah. But I'm guessing those relationships weren't all like holiday cards and potlucks, right? There had to be
Yeah.
some strings attached.
Oh, for sure. I mean, the fact that they even used that phrase, email family, it's telling, right?
Right.
It suggests this level of closeness that you just don't get in, like, a purely transactional relationship. Like you were saying before, here's some money, do some research.
Right.
This is deeper than that. And those kinds of relationships, they create this sense of, like, loyalty, of reciprocity, even if it's never explicitly stated.
It's like an unspoken agreement. We're all friends here. We take care of each other.
Exactly. And Coke, they weren't shy about using those relationships to their advantage.
Right? Like that whole thing with the Physical Activity Council, right?
Yes, remember that. They were like, oh, hey, you're a researcher who's interested in physical activity. Well, we just happen to know some people at the Physical Activity Council. Let us make an introduction.
And what's the strategy there? What are they hoping to gain by playing matchmaker?
It's all about access and influence, right? Like, by connecting these researchers with these big organizations, Coca-Cola is getting their foot in the door. They're able to, at least indirectly, influence the conversation around, physical activity and health.
So it's kind of like they're playing three-dimensional chess while everyone else is still stuck on checkers. They're thinking several moves ahead.
Exactly. They're playing the long game, and they're playing it well. And remember, it wasn't just introductions. They offered other kinds of support, too, right?
Right, right. Like for the researchers' careers and even their institutions. Like they were really invested in these people.
Totally. Remember when they offered to help develop a whole communications plan for the West Virginia University School of Public Health?
Wow. I mean, that's a lot of work.
That's not something you'd normally associate with a beverage company, is it?
Not at all. It's like they're trying to be this silent partner, shaping the direction of research and public health messaging in these very subtle but very significant ways. And most people probably have no idea that this is going on.
And that's the point, right?
Exactly. And that's what's kind of unsettling about all of this. It makes you wonder, like, what else is out there? What other unseen forces are shaping the information we're consuming every day?
It's a good question, and it's a good reminder that we can't just passively absorb information, right? Well, we have to be critical thinkers. We have to be skeptical, especially when it comes to, something as important as our health. Always, always question the source.
Right. Consider the motives. Who's benefiting from this information?
Exactly. Follow the money.
Right. Don't just take things at face value. Dig a little deeper.
100%.
Now, before we wrap things up, I do want to be fair and mention that the study we've been discussing, it did point out some limitations in their research.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Like every study, there are always going to be those little caveats, right?
Right, right.
hmm
So, what should we keep in mind?
Well, as juicy as those emails are, they're really just a glimpse into a much bigger, more complicated story. We have to remember this research, it was focused on Coca-Cola's interactions with just two public institutions.
Okay.
So there's a whole lot that we don't see here. Who knows what kind of similar activity might be happening with other institutions, right?
Yeah, it's like we're only seeing the tip of the iceberg. There's a whole lot more going on beneath the surface.
Exactly. And remember, we're talking about emails specifically. There could be other communications like internal memos, discussions, you know, phone calls even, who knows, that weren't included in this analysis.
Right, because they weren't accessible. Right.
Exactly. So as insightful as this research is, and it is, we're only getting a partial view.
Right, right. A snapshot in time. But even with those limitations, I think this study raises some really important questions about, where our information comes from, how it's shaped, and who's trying to influence our choices.
I totally agree. If anything, it should make us even more curious, more determined to find out the truth.
Well said. Well, thank you so much for taking this deep dive with us. Always a pleasure to chat with you.
Always great to be here.
And to our listeners, we hope this episode has given you plenty to think about and maybe even sparked some healthy skepticism. Remember, there's always more beneath the surface. Until next time, stay curious.